Chun Tao. I'm one of the student committee mentorship program co-chair. And today I'm with Dr. Deborah Ragin and Dr. Martin Iguchi for the topic on entering the job market. So I thought we can start with brief self-introductions.
Okay, which do you want to start first?
Go ahead, Martin, that's fine.
Okay. All right, I'm Martin Iguchi. I'm currently a senior behavioral scientist with the RAND Corporation. I started out my career as with a postdoctoral fellowship at Johns Hopkins in drug policy. I then became a assistant professor in psychiatry at the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey. So that was my first position. It's a research position. From there, we went to Hahnemann University, moved our group over the river, and then I was recruited by the RAND Corporation to run their drug policy research center. From there, I got recruited to be chair of community health sciences at UCLA. So that's my current position.
Wow, that's a lot to follow. I am Deborah Fish Ragin. I consider myself a health psychologist, although truthfully that's not the way I trained. When I was getting my degree at Harvard, I trained in experimental psychology as a psycholinguist. So I'm quite a bit away from that now, but I definitely have drawn on those experimental training skills throughout my life and throughout my career as a psychologist. I currently am a professor at Montclair State University, which is in Montclair, New Jersey. And for those of you who don't know the West Coast that well, the East Coast that well, it is about 15 miles south of New York City. I have been at Montclair for about 16 years now. But I started my career, ironically, in London, England. I was a higher scientific officer, I love those titles, for the Economic and Social Research Council in London, England, which is something like our National Institutes of Health kinds of foundation or institutions. And when I returned back to the United States after a couple of years working there, I had a number of different positions, including the HIV/AIDS Center at Columbia University. I worked also in the Department of Emergency Medicine at Mount Sinai School of Medicine, doing research on health disparities. And then eventually landed at Montclair. I had a few other things that happened in between. I'll look forward to telling you more about that as we talk about our experiences and thoughts about what might be interesting ideas for students as they're beginning to approach the job market.
Yeah, thank you both. And it sounds like Deborah and Martin, you both have had quite a journey of being in the job market, of going through different positions and even across different settings. So I'm just curious, like, how was it like for you when you first entered the job market? If you could recall what that was like.
Well, for me, it was odd because my first job was in London, England. I moved to London. My husband, at the time, we were newlyweds, and he was working for a bank, for a multinational corporation, and he got a position in London, so we were living as expatriates. So I didn't have a chance to start my job search in the States before we moved. Mm-hmm. And it was a little bit difficult, I must say, because there is a bit of a difference in how England and the U.S. looked at researchers in the field of psychology. I was warned that, American psychologists had a little trouble finding jobs in the academic job market. But at the time that I applied, the thing that most piqued my curiosity was the Economic and Social Research Council. And that was a good fit for me because I was able to use the skills and the knowledge that I acquired to evaluate proposals for funding, which was quite interesting. I must also admit that it was fun because I got put on the A list for a lot of parties because I was a funder. But it was a different experience than some of the students might have, because it was trying to find a job in a different country, in a slightly different cultural setting than what I would have expected in the United States.
Yeah, I would say that, first of all, I was in graduate school for 9 years. And so during that period, I was in the experimental psych program at BU. And one of the things that I took advantage of is I took every course that was available in the psychology department, since I was there for so long. That included all the clinical courses. So I actually had a really strong and diverse background in terms of skill sets. And then when I went and did my postdoctoral fellowship at Hopkins, I realized also that that the amount of rigor and hard work that was required to be a researcher in the U.S. was really remarkable. And I think it placing myself where the environment was very competitive, and where those who could show me and mentor me how to do research the right way was really a critical step for me. It oriented me to not just how to write grants, but how to set up personal networks that would help me to get to know key players, help people who are going to make judgments about my grants, to know who I am, and to interface with them. So I would say one of the first steps that I took was to make a list of 50 individuals that I wanted to meet during my postdoctoral fellowship, who I thought were influential in the field. And it took me until about a year after my postdoc to finish meeting all the people on my list. But it wasn't just a matter of going out and meeting each of these individuals. It was a matter of really understanding what their work was, having questions for them, being very clear that I knew their work. I had, I thought, interesting questions to ask. And it ended up that I became friends with, I would say, most of them. And to this day, in fact, many of the visits that I made, people still think that it was a job interview and that I had turned them down. So I actually think that it served me in a number of ways. The very last person that I had on my list to meet was a person at UCSF named Sharon Hall, who was running their center grant at the time. And I said to Sharon, you know, you're the last person on my list that I had developed during my postdoc that I wanted to meet. And I said, you're the last person on my list, and I'm finally crossing off you as the last person on the list. And she said, Martin, we met 2 years ago during your postdoc, the first 2 weeks of your postdoc. And so I had to laugh. I said, well, I don't remember you because I wasn't prepared to meet you. And I think that that's the really important thing is the preparations, because not only did I remember the people that I met with, but I think they remembered me.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And you certainly bring very interesting experiences as you both enter the job market. And I think you both already spoke to some of it, but I wonder, like, when do you think will be a meaningful time for us students, graduate students, think about like entering the job market? Or what kind of thoughts do you think should be, what kind of considerations do you think will benefit us to consider in various stages of our training?
You know, I think Martin spoke to it somewhat in terms of making the list of people he needed to meet. In my way of looking at that, also my way of looking at my experiences and in my time in grad school, you start almost the day you walk in the door. It's not too early. I mean, you don't start necessarily with a panic, but you start with the expectation that you're going to be working and meeting colleagues, and you want to know as much as you can about who these people are and where they work and what they do and what they enjoy and where there are some commonalities, because you're building that network of colleagues that you may call on at some point in time, or they may call on you. So you start first, very small in your own network, in your own community, getting to know the people that you're in the programs with, but then you blossom out. And this is where I would have to stress that, opportunities to go to conferences and other venues where colleagues gather is really very important. And I may be saying something that's a little out of school, but as important as it is to sit in those sessions and learn from the research that's being presented, it's probably more important to be in the hallways networking with people, attending the meetings that are not so structured or events that are not so structured, to get to know people. I also would say that I benefited largely from both advisors and graduate students who I worked with, who took it upon themselves to introduce me to people, and then continuing and furthering those contacts and those networks, because again, you never know, later on down the line where those contacts could lead as well. So my admonition is start day one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But I would also say that what was really helpful too was my peer mentors. I always felt that in most of the settings that I've been in, there were a lot of people there, both in graduate school, my postdocs, all of my jobs. There were always people there that were a lot smarter than I was. And so I felt like forming relationships and really finding a support system to provide me with both confidence, but also a sense of how to navigate, learning from my peers, what they were doing, how they were making connections, what kinds of relationships they had formed locally. So particularly at BU, we had Harvard nearby. We had a number of, I was able to actually go and hear talks from major experimental psychologists, leaders in the field, and those kinds of connections were actually made through my peers who had already made those connections and would invite me to accompany them. So I think it's really about forming these social networks and social relationships that keep you focused and not necessarily on where you think you're going, but being open to possibilities across a range of different disciplines and environments.
And if I could I'd like to agree with Martin about that, because I think one of the lessons that I've learned, particularly because I switched fields of study, but one of the lessons that I've learned is keeping an open mind, being flexible, because you really don't know at such a young age whether what you're studying and what you're devoting your time to at that moment is what really will interest or entice you 10, 15 years later. When I was at graduate school at Harvard, I actually had the most fun. I probably shouldn't say this, but had the most fun at the acoustic labs at MIT. Wonderful professor there, Victor Zhu, who really sponsored me and helped me to learn that field. And had I been able to continue doing that work, I think it would have been fun and exciting. But I'm nowhere near that now. And the change has come about almost in a serendipity manner. So I think being open to experiences, exposures, people, because you're in one area now, but it may not be the area you stay in later on. And having a wealth of experiences to draw on might help you when you decide, if you decide to make a change.
Right.
Yeah, and thank you for both for kind of highlighting the importance of us taking all the advantages or opportunities we had in graduate school to learn as much as we can, and then developing network of colleagues early on, using support from your advisor, peers, and also talking about being open and flexible. And those are all wonderful tips to help us to prepare for entering a job market or just grow in general. So I wonder, what are some of the common or unexpected challenges you faced or you see students face nowadays as they consider job market?
Well, I think one of the real challenges for people that are considering academic positions is the shrinking academic job market. Um, it hasn't really shrunk that much in terms of actual numbers, I think, of professors, although it has, some of the recent statistics I've seen indicate that positions for tenured professors have decreased. But we have in the field now quite a number of people who are adjuncts looking for positions, fully qualified PhD with good research who cannot find positions. And that's a challenge. So that is something that I think everyone needs to be aware of, not to be scared of, but to be aware of. I think the other thing which I'm learning more and more about is how different colleges and universities, if you're looking for an academic position, are moving away from the tenure track, tenured positions to contractual arrangements. Montclair has what's called instructional specialists, but others have professors of practice. They can go by various different names. Essentially what it means is that a person is hired for a contractual period 3 to 5 years, which is renewable, but it's renewed based on the amount of work that a person has put up and the evaluation of that university. So while it is possible to get a job and have a contract that gives some job security, it is not the same as striving for or achieving tenure. There are drawbacks and benefits to both sides, but I think students just need to be aware that the market is changing. And so what they may have thought was the way the market operated before, you apply, you get a tenure track position, and in 6 or 7 years, you're awarded tenure. That system is changing. Not to say not to do it, just be aware of the change.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. I'd say that the level of competition has increased pretty dramatically. I've seen it at every level and in every work environment that I've been in. But I would say that a more difficult aspect of this is that it's become academia has become much more corporate and much more packaged. And so the personal touch, I'd say, is missing in so many ways, that it's being, that the schools are being run as businesses much more than they are as academic environments. And that many of the policies that you see are really intended to decrease liability more than they are to promote academic excellence or to promote finances over academia. And so those prioritizations, I would say, actually in many ways have a perverse effect in that, and I think you see them playing out with the latest admission scandals, with the number of essentially breakdowns in what would have been violations of academic integrity in the past are now sort of excused as issues of, well, we need the money. So the focus on doing things for the public good is lessened, I think, and more for the institutional good. So I mean, maybe this is just the musings of someone who's older and thought it was better in the old days, but I really do, I really am concerned about the emphasis on finance over academia.
Yeah, it's quite a saddening trend, and I'm curious, how do you navigate all these changes that's happening in the job market, and if you have any tips on students, especially those who are considering and considering entering academia at this time, what are some things they could consider or try as they start like exploring the job market?
Well, I think that the issue comes down to, again, when you enter into any work environment, is to get a good sense of how people feel they're being treated, and really spending time with the individuals that you hope to be working with, to get a sense of you know, how much of a role they have in the institutional governance, which I think actually goes a long way towards mitigating a lot of these kinds of influences. I was aware of one hire in the UC system that at a very high level, where I thought the person wouldn't last because UCLA, or not UCLA, but the UC system has such a good faculty governance system. And in fact, the person that was hired ended up getting fired within 2 years because of the pushback from faculty. So that there are places and there are institutional means for sort of fighting for integrity and fighting for faculty rights. And there, I think, you want to look for environments where you have those kinds of systems in place. But also just getting a good sense of how people are experiencing the work environment. I think that's really critical.
I would agree with you, Martin. I think getting a sense of the environment is really important, but also understanding what the institution values. Mm-hmm. Their academic institutions are very, very different. Some really put an emphasis on student and teaching. Others put an emphasis on research, and they don't really focus that much on teaching. Some are very service-oriented, so it really depends on the institution, and it would behoove the students to really try to do some real investigative work early on. First, figure out what it is they want. Are they someone who really values teaching over research, or is research the primary driver for them? And then to look for institutions that match or marry as close as possible. But they differ greatly, and whatever they stress, that's going to be what you're held accountable to when you're evaluating for either renewal of contract or tenure. So if they value something that is either not of interest to you or not your strong suit, that could be a problem. And you'd rather know that first rather than later.
Mm-hmm. I would agree strongly with the values part. In fact, I would say that certainly in the leadership roles that I've had, one of the things that I found invaluable was going through value identification exercises with the groups that I'm working with. You find early on that by really examining what's important to you and what you care about and what your priorities are, and lay them out in front of others, what ends up happening is you find common ground and you find the areas that you can build on. And I think that's really been an important process. One of the things that I found in looking for a good working environment was looking at the mission statement of the institution and asking people how they felt the institution was working towards or against that mission statement. Mm-hmm. And I think in particular, for example, when I was walking around Georgetown's campus and seeing all of the essentially Jesuit signatures of women and men for others, of sort of working for the greater good and for the Magus, those kinds of things, I found to be really, I found it wonderful that they were sort of pronounced so loudly across the campus, the things that they cared about, and that the service orientation and the focus on teaching excellence for me made it a really wonderful environment for the faculty. Mm-hmm. It ended up not being the best for me because my boss and I didn't get along, but for the faculty, it was a fantastic environment and really a place that I love being around the students. I love being around the faculty. And it was because of the fact that everybody shared the same values and really cared passionately about teaching, cared passionately about about being world citizens. And I think that that was made for a really terrific work environment. And the same thing with the RAND Corporation, even though they do a lot of work that as a kid I found objectionable. I used to actually go and throw rocks at the building when I was a kid. Yeah, because that was during the Vietnam War, and I objected to all what I saw the warmongering anyway from the RAND Corporation. But I joined them because I found that the researchers there really valued the fact that the work really is intended to be for the common good, and that the work is intended to be really placed out for use by the world. We're not allowed to take contracts, at least on the domestic side. On the military side, you have your limitations, but on the domestic side, the work has to be made available for publication and for use by others. And so I really valued that emphasis.
Yeah, and thank you for both really highlighting again about the fit between the environment and the person who's trying to enter the job market in terms of their values, what they look for in the work environment. And I think that speaks probably to some extent about work-life balance as well. So I wonder if you can each speak to some in terms of how does that play out in your decision? Was your job choices or even navigate in your current job?
Well, there I think I have a whole wealth of experience. And this will resonate with some, and perhaps not as readily for others right now, but work-life balance was really important to me. I knew that I wanted to have a family, and so it was going to be constantly evaluating what was in the best interest of my family versus what was in my interest in terms of developing my career. And I think one of the things I want to tell these emerging professionals now is you don't always get it right. It's not something that, there's a formula for which you can just follow a path and everything will be fine. When I started working, I was without children. And as I said, I started in London. When we returned from London, I hit a couple of what I would call jobs, not really things that were building blocks for my career, or so I thought. I did some work for Border Cooperative Educational Services in New York City. It was psychological testing. That wasn't my field, but I was responsible. I supervised testers and evaluators and translators, about 40 of them, to do this work in school systems. It wasn't something that I considered I would ever draw upon, but having that supervisory experience, having that managerial experience was something that served me well later on down the road. When I started having a family, though, that's when I started making decisions about, okay, I can have this kind of a work schedule, which allows me flexibility, or I can work a 9 to 6 or 9 to 7 kind of environment and not have much flexibility for my family. And I chose the flexibility. I did that thinking that I was going to pay a cost, that I would not be able to have the kind of growth and development in my career, my professional life. And I was wrong. And the thing I'd like to emphasize for people is, you never know what you can get unless you ask for it. Mm-hmm. After Border Cooperative Educational Services, I actually did get a teaching job. I taught for Hunter College in the City University of New York for a couple of years. And I thought that was going to be a perfect work-life balance because it's an academic position. You get the summers off, you get weekends, you get days off during the week, except that most of the teaching there was nighttime. And having a child already, I could not envision having her gone at school and missing her and her missing me during the day and not seeing her at nighttime. Yeah, my husband was there, but I wouldn't see her. So it was a choice. The work-life balance was out of balance in that kind of that kind of setting. And so I did the unthinkable. I walked away from a tenure track position. And I was told, you will never get another tenure track job offer ever. If you walk away from that, that was wrong. And so you have to do what you know is right for your family, in spite of the fact what some may counsel you as being the wrong choice or not advisable choice. I had a couple of different positions after that, but one of the ones I mentioned already was working in the emergency medicine, Department of Emergency Medicine, School of Medicine in Mount Sinai School of Medicine. I negotiated a part-time schedule. They wanted a full-time researcher. I negotiated a part-time schedule. So I was there every day, but I was there from 9 to 2, with the understanding that if there was some work that really needed to get done, I'd take it home. But home was important. I needed to be home for my family. So I guess the thing I'd like to stress more than anything is there is flexibility, especially now in the workforce, where there is expectation that people don't necessarily want to conform to the work schedule that has been what we came to believe for decades. You have to ask, you have to explore, you have to pursue. But above all, I think it's important for the students that are coming out now to ask themselves, what are my priorities? How do they align with a job that I'm interested in taking? Can I postpone this part of my life for X number of years to pursue this career? And if I do, what are the consequences? These are personal decisions. Not everyone is going to come to the same place with regards to what they value or what they think they can defer. But if you know a little bit about yourself, if you understand and be honest with yourself about what is important for you, then that'll help you make the choices career-wise that will not only be satisfying, but you won't feel a conflict between when you're at work and when you're at home and where you think you should be somewhere else.
Yeah, work-life balance is something I have to admit I probably didn't have at all at the beginning of my career. At the same time, I would say that I loved what I was doing. And so in terms of my own mental health, I would say that because I was working nonstop at jobs that I really enjoyed doing and I was really passionate about, and where the focus really was on helping others and in my own way, making a difference in the world, I felt that it was worth the trade-off. Now, at the same time, I would say that my wife didn't always agree that it was worth the extra efforts. It put much more burden on the female half of our partnership, and that I definitely recognized that in many ways there was a sort of a male privilege there in a sense that I had that support system in place, and my wife sacrificed for me where each time we moved to a new position she had to start her dance career over again. And fortunately, she was outstanding and always got jobs. For example, when we moved to Philadelphia, she actually was hired by the University of the Arts to teach sight unseen, just on reputation. So I felt that it was good that she was highly competent and was able to get a faculty job immediately. But partly because she also had a tremendously rich social network. And so she had a lot of people willing to vouch for her, saying that she was a wonderful teacher. I would also say, though, that that was part of the key to being able to work so hard was doing the kind of work that fit my sort of personal value system and what I wanted to do with my life. I've actually had the opportunity to work in the private sector in jobs. For example, when I was in college, I was offered 2 7-Eleven stores for free, where I would own them, and the franchises at the time were worth about $100,000 a piece. But it wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to go to graduate school, so I turned that down. And in graduate school, I was actually offered the position of vice president of a produce company that my family had been involved with, and the starting pay was $200,000 a year back in the 80s, which is a considerable amount. with the promise of about $1 million a year after that. But the fact is that I wanted to focus on helping others and being a psychologist. I know it sounds crazy, but those of us who I think are in this profession do it because our intent is to be there for others. And I think that's always been my emphasis. It's carried me through my entire career. And even today, as I think about, what do I want to do with the rest of my life, it remains the same. I like what I do. I love what I do. It's exactly the right career path for me, and I want to continue it. So, in the early days, my work was out in the fields in Newark, Jersey City, Camden, New Jersey, walking the streets, working with drug users, and getting people into treatment for HIV and drug use. And I think that, we made a big difference. Yes, I lacked work-life balance early on, but I would say that it was a pursuit of passion. So in many ways, I think I probably would have done it anyway. I would have done something else anyway, very similar, because it was something that I felt was really important and wanted to do.
I think you both spoke to like how personal these decisions can be, because it's unique to everyone's position in terms of where they are in life, what values they have, what's more important, like the trade-offs, Martin, you spoke about. And also, I really like, Deborah, how you talk about like sometimes we have those thoughts about if I give up on this job, that I will never get another job like this. When you said that I will never get a tenure track position again if I give that up. And I think that's important for a lot of our listeners to know that sometimes we make sacrifices based on potentially incorrect thoughts that may deter us from like pursuing a better work-life balance in that sense. And also, like Deborah earlier, you mentioned about like, you never know what you're gonna get, and like you ask for it, and then you talk about you ask for more flexible work schedules. So I wonder, like for those of us who are looking for jobs, what are some of the things you think we should ask or should attempt asking, since there's potential benefits for that?
Oh, I really do have to jump in here because this is such an issue for my family. I have two daughters. We have two daughters, and my husband was always very keen to encourage them to bargain, to negotiate, because for women particularly, we don't bargain and negotiate nearly as much as we should. And I'm not saying that all men do, but there is a gender difference in terms of bargaining and negotiating. And so what I would really encourage all emerging professionals to do, but certainly women, is, don't assume that first offer is where you should stop. It's where you start. And if you're being offered a job, reassess, ask yourself, what is it that I want or that I need? Either in terms of salary or in terms of work schedule or class schedule or responsibilities that are spelled out in that job description. If it's not in an academic setting, you need to ask, what is it that I most care about, and argue for that. Ask for it. I mean, the way I like to think of it is, you already have the no. What you're gambling for is the yes. You have the job. You don't quite have those specific things that you would like to have. You're trying to see if you can get them. If you have the job offer on the table, it's not going to go away because you asked for a few more dollars, or that you asked for a different kind of schedule or a different configuration or a different job responsibility. So you need to practice negotiating. And it can be very, very scary at first because you feel a little bit intimidated or like a little worried about what they're going to respond. But the only thing they can say is, no. The offer that we give you stands as is, and then it's up to you to decide what you want to do. But negotiation is part of the whole job application process. No employer, I believe, expects anyone to take the first offer that's offered. They expect that they're going to have a little back and forth. And so I would really encourage you to get ready and to do that.
I would agree with that strongly, and I would say that it's not just about salary. That in particular, if you're a minority researcher, to be very upfront about concerns regarding being placed in the role of being the minority person in the department, or to be designated as a person that has to be on all of the different committees, or to just, I guess not to be voicing this necessarily, but to be aware that in many departments, if you're one of the few minority faculty, that you end up being on more committees than other people, just because they always need a minority member. And so just to be clear about what your service requirements will be, and that you'll be held to, that you're required to do, what your mentoring role will be, because very frequently minority scholars find themselves overwhelmed by the minority students who want to go to a mentor who they identify with. And so there are extra pressures, I think, especially early on in the career when you're trying to establish your teaching loads and you're trying to get your research started, to also have what are not requirements necessarily, but end up being sort of personal obligations because you feel badly about turning people away or saying no to anybody. So I think it's really important to establish early on and get a feel for early on what's absolutely required, and then for yourself what you think you're capable of doing within an environment that's going to be putting those pressures on you naturally. So I think that it's a little bit trickier aspect to navigate, but it's a good thing to be aware of.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue, because I was wondering if you have any specific tips for students who identify as racial ethnic minority or minority identity of any other kind, like I don't know, Martin, you already spoke to some of it, so like anything else that for students that we can consider or prepare ourselves as we go through this process?
Well, it's fascinating, but in some fields, maybe, and actually I would say psychology is probably guilty of this as much as any, that our guild mentality and training often means that we pigeonhole ourselves. Many of the African-American and Hispanic students who are working closely with an African-American or Hispanic mentor often actually are in areas that are very oriented to, let's say, health disparities or to qualitative approaches, those kinds of areas. And I've had discussions actually with a lot of leaders of different associations, like the American Sociological Association. I've seen this at the American Psychological Association, that this emphasis on learning by mentor approach often silos minority scholars into areas that are seen as for minorities and or more minority oriented. And so it's really important, I think, to at least recognize that places some constraints on your job market possibilities or how you might be perceived. And so it's important to break those stereotypes, I think, and to be willing to venture beyond the apprentice model to make certain you have a lot of training experiences that perhaps are more quantitative if you're qualitatively oriented, that are in some ways, be aware that if you have an interest in areas that are a little bit more mainstream and a little bit better funded, that does help your career a bit. Because you don't want to be pursuing the same dollars as many of your peers. I actually had this conversation once with one of the former directors of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, where I was saying that trying to get grants funded to look at Asian Pacific Islander issues was a really difficult task, because the question always came up, are there enough Asians in America to care about this? I mean, it wasn't exactly stated that way, but that was the implicit message that, that this doesn't generalize adequately, or are you going to be able to recruit enough individuals to participate, or this is the model minority, why would you want to be, looking at this group? And the fact is that because nobody was looking, there were no numbers. And so you couldn't, you actually didn't even have a baseline where you could draw from the literature because there was no literature. So I made the point to the director and I said, look, I've had a ton of money from NIDA, but I can't get a single grant funded to look at Asian Pacific Islander issues. And he acknowledged that that obviously indicated a problem because, I had a really strong track record, but when it came to looking at issues that I personally wanted to look more at, there just wasn't any funding for it. So I think it's important to understand that sometimes we have to personally break out of our molds and out of what in some ways the silos that we're pushed into and break out of that.
No, I agree wholeheartedly, Martin, and I think of it of the limitations that I see for students with training in terms of what they look at in terms of role models and what those role models, not purposely but inadvertently, sort of share. If you're particularly tied or aligned with a professor who you like, and that field becomes something that you then like, and then you follow in those footsteps, and that's great, except when students who feel like they really want to have a minority mentor, and that minority mentor is in some of the fields that you've explained before, being somewhat limited in terms of the scope that they may include. So they're more qualitative kind of studies, or maybe even more on the clinical side. And so then we see a disproportionate number of minority students gravitating to those fields. And that I think is unfortunate for two reasons. I think that underplays a talent that a lot of minority students have. It also perhaps gets them to question whether they have the talent or skills to pursue those other areas or those other careers. And I think that it then deprives the larger society of people who have something to offer in those fields, in those areas. So I would really encourage students to do really like you did in your graduate career, and take a plethora of courses, a variety of courses on a number of different areas to sample, to find out where their real interest lies, and to pursue that, finding as supportive a mentor as possible and going forward. I think once, for some of the students who may be, in fact, teaching assistants or doing teaching assistantships in their graduate career, I think it's also important for them to realize that those undergraduate students, particularly if the teaching assistant is a minority and the undergraduate students are a minority, they're looking at you, the teaching assistant, as someone to look up to. You become a model for them. And it is as important to model for them excellence and openness to new ideas and experience as it is for the faculty mentor to model that for the teaching assistant as well. It's important that we continue this stream of examples and leading by examples so that the subsequent generations can follow in a like footstep. Lastly, I'd like to say I think I really did benefit from having people who were African American, who were in experimental psychology while at Harvard. But one of the things I noted was there was only one. There was only one. There were, and most of the other African Americans who went through the program were in other more qualitative or clinical fields. So that issue pertains, and it becomes a problem going forward. I would like to add also that I think the issue pertains also in clinical work. I have a number of colleagues who talk about the difficulties they sometimes have when meeting new patients who see them for the first time, and boy, that wasn't the face they expected to see, and how they have to work to overcome those difficulties in order to be the kind of professional they know they can be and to help the people who seek their help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you both talk about there's challenges certainly as minority students in the field of psychology still, but then there's also have been some positive trends. And a lot of it is also why we're doing the mentorship program here. So students who are considering entering job market can see that you, Martin and Deborah, you've gone through this process and still in the process of trying to make these positive changes for the other people and for the field of psychology. And for students to know, even though it was difficult, that it's doable and we can be part of this force of pursuing our own values, dreams, passion, but also making a change to the field. So I guess we want to switch gear a little bit and wonder, like, if you could talk about your experiences working in different settings, because I know you both are really passionate about doing research, but you've worked in like different like hospitals or departments, academic settings. Like, what do you see are the differences across different settings as a research psychologist or doing some applied work as well?
There are a lot of differences. I have to say, quite honestly, when I think back at the different places that I've done research at, it was Columbia's HIV Center, where we worked with HIV and AIDS prevention among adolescents. It was a domestic violence shelter where we did research on domestic women who had been exposed to domestic violence earlier in their years, in their own as children, and what that meant for them in terms of substance use and suicide ideology. We did research at Mount Sinai School of Medicine looking at access to health care, and continued that work into the position that I have now at Montclair State University. And all four of those places really had a very different feel in terms of the value that was placed on the research and how easy or difficult it was for me to get that research done. When I did research at Columbia HIV, that probably was the closest thing to just a research think tank. We had all of our time, all of our day was just dedicated to designing the research study, to getting it funded, to conducting the research, to analyzing the data, to presenting it. It was the classic research environment, and that was fun, and I enjoyed it. It had a field element to it because we were actually in the field implementing the intervention programs. There was an 8-week intervention course to teach adolescents safer sexual health practices. So that was fun, and I really, really enjoyed that. And I enjoyed working with that interdisciplinary team. When I went to the domestic violence shelter to work in doing research, that was very different. It was a very small shop. People really didn't have that great of a handle on research, let alone research practices, let alone getting anything approved by the IRB. So in my position as director of the evaluation unit, I was leading all of that and taking all the skills that I had learned before at the HIV Center and had put into practice and actually implementing and directing that research. At Mount Sinai School of Medicine, very different field there. They had a well-oiled engine for research. That was their bread and butter. That's what they did. They had a very full IRB team. They had a very full development office that would help you, and the finance office that would help you put together those parts of the research grant that, were kind of foreign to you. That was their specialty. That's what they did. So all they really wanted us to do was to put together the ideas, the thoughts, the plan for research, and sketch out a timeline, and they could finish filling in all the rest of the details. So we had a lot of assistance and a lot of help. And not surprisingly, I worked there for a little over 2 years, and the second year I was there, we pumped out 9 grants. And that's something that's doable when you have that kind of a support team to back you up. by comparison, Montclair is still developing a lot of its infrastructure to help with the development of grants. And so getting grants written and through that process at Montclair is a little bit slower because that infrastructure doesn't exist, and consequently it slows down the process of getting grants out the door. So depending upon where you work, how well structured and how well developed those systems are, you can either be very productive and pump out lots of grants, or you can struggle as you try to get things together that take a lot more time and effort.
I would agree with that. I started my career in settings that were research first, and but where I think the experience at Hopkins allowed me to actually understand what it took to be successful in the grant game, and how to put strong teams together. And so wherever I've gone, I've sort of built on the model that I learned from I think being in a place where people were professional grant getters and grant writers and really understood how to create those sort of machines. So I've tried to replicate that every place that I've been, and I would say that I've been really successful at that. But having had that model and the willingness to just continually write and write almost nonstop is as much as important. In fact, I even gave up doing the analyses myself, which was something that I could obsess on and enjoy for hours and hours on end, as crazy as that sounds. I had to give up the analytic part because I spent too much time doing that, and I found that I needed to have that time for writing, because writing for a researcher is the currency. It's the currency for promotion, it's the currency for getting grants, it's the essential element. So I really had to learn how to spend time and budget time for writing and getting the written products done. And I think increasingly in today's work environment, it's the writing skills and writing clearly and writing well, but more than anything else, writing often, that becomes the currency of the realm, and what has brought me, I would say, many of the rewards that I've had in my career. But I would also say, because I was really successful early on, that I was able to give credit to others for the writing products and to turn over leadership on many projects to my colleagues. And as much as possible, I found that that by sharing credit and by sharing leadership and by involving others in that writing process, that what ended up happening is I built up a very strong core of colleagues who trusted me and who I trusted them, and we worked well together. And having that team, I think, and the willingness to give credit liberally meant that they were also willing to give me credit much more liberally, and to share in our mutual successes. So I actually had, in fact, I would get yelled at occasionally by my boss who had a different approach, by one of my bosses who had a different approach, that I was giving away too many publications and giving away too much credit. And I disagreed. I said, no, it's actually my sort of work philosophy that I didn't need to be first author in every paper. I didn't need to be controlling every aspect of the research, that it was important to share the wealth and to have everybody involved. Mm-hmm. In fact, one year we actually had all of the researchers, the funded researchers, agree to serve as research assistants for one of our research associates who was a master's level person. And we let him design a study, and we went and did the interviews for him because we wanted to show that we wanted to help in the development of our junior colleagues. And every one of our PIs actually contributed to the paper, contributed to the interviews. And I think that kind of an atmosphere created a real sense of team, and I think it increased our productivity. So I think in some ways it didn't matter where I was. I created the atmosphere I wanted, and that I thought we needed to be successful. But as much as anything, it was a matter of trying to make certain as much as possible that it was a group effort and a shared effort.
Could I add also, Martin, I think you raised some really important elements, and I think it speaks to what the students should look for themselves too. Looking for a partnership or a mentorship when they get their first job or second job with someone like who you're portraying, someone who has a vision toward helping to mentor, to bring up through the ranks their mentee or the student or the newly hired person, so that they learn the ropes and that they get some credit as they begin to establish their career. It's really, really important. And like what you're saying, I feel that sense of obligation myself, and I do that work with my students in our publications. But I think that what saddens me often is when I hear of students who are working in faculty labs and doing a lot of the work. And I always ask them, well, are you going to get your name on the publication? Is that a publication where you will get authorship? And I frequently hear students say, well, that professor doesn't work that way. And I think that's wrong. I can't dictate to them what they should do, obviously, but I think that I could encourage people to find those mentors who will not only teach you the ropes and let you work with them, but also give you credit for the work that you do in the form of authorship. That's what we should be doing. Senior level professionals should be doing that for our junior professionals that come along, and they are there, but you may have to look a little bit to find them.
Yep, thank you. Do you have anything to add since we're approaching our time today? To any of the conversation we had? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I would just say that one of the things that I would emphasize at all levels is learning how to talk in plain language and to communicate to the larger public what you're doing. No matter what your role, no matter what you're doing, it's important to learn how to communicate to children, to parents, to your students, that in as plain a language as possible, and with as little jargon as possible, the importance of what you're doing. I would say that in communicating science, move away from the emphasis on methods to an emphasis on the question, and talking about the importance of what you think you're looking at and the things that you found that were exciting. I think more than anything else, as teachers or as researchers, we have to communicate. And I know that as psychologists, we understand that, and yet we contribute to the problem. And so I would say that the most successful courses that I've taught were the ones that emphasize communicating science to the public as a final product. And I think that, I think everybody comes to understand by doing how important that is. That would be my final say.
I think what I would add to that, the communication I think is hugely important. And I think that's one of the skill sets that students who train in psychology can take away. It's a very valuable commodity in the workforce, whether you're going into academia or research or clinical or any other field. So I would encourage students to look carefully at the skills that they have developed as a result of their training. And in my estimation, what I see are the written communication skills, which are honed. I mean, if they're really working and practicing these communication skills, much like Martin said, for clarity of communication, that's a very, very valuable skill set. The other I would add would be quantitative and analytical skills. That is something that we as psychologists can uniquely contribute to the field. One of the things that we can do that statisticians don't do, for example, is we're really practiced with analyzing information that comes in, making sense out of it, and then telling people what these data say in a way that helps them to understand something about human behavior or human thought, human processing. That is a very unique skill set. And I would encourage people to really build and get those skills down patch so that they too can be applied, and they can be applied in fields other than psychology. Believe it or not, insurance underwriters love people who can do quantitative analytical skills so that they can understand how much they want to charge people for their insurance. The banking industry, the food industry, the pharmaceuticals industry, all kinds of industries value the quantitative skills that psychology has and imparts to its students. So those two skill sets, quantitative skills, data analysis, and interpretation, and communication skills are really very strong skills to take out to any place in the marketplace. And I would encourage students to really build on those so that they could use those whether they go into psychology or anywhere else.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Deborah and Martin, for spending an hour with us today talking about a topic entering the job market. And as a reminder to our student audience, that they've both graciously offered 3 individual mentorship sessions virtually. So if you're interested in these opportunities, please reach out to our Division 45 student committee email, and then we'll help arrange that to make that happen. Thank you again.
Thank you.